All right. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And with me today for the first time is a really cool guest. His podcast is on Alt Media United. His podcast is titled Philosophical Minds, and he is Sky Mathis. Sky, welcome to the show, man. It's nice to have you here. As we said, nice to meet you. And, right off the bat, I'm going to ask you, does your family think you're crazy for the mind that you have, which is philosophical?
Well, first and foremost, it's an honor to be on your show, honor and a privilege. I want to say thank you for having me on here. And your show's definitely become a staple in my audio diet, I'd say. I'm someone I love listening to podcasts just as much as I love doing them. And yeah, I'm a huge fan as somewhat of a connoisseur of podcasts, I guess I would say. I consume quite a bit, and you're definitely one of my favorite hosts out there. Truly, I think that you're an audio artist. I'd say in the way that you present and structure your podcast with, the music, the occasional poetic introductions, all stacked with great guests and awesome information. I think you've cultivated an excellent conversational capacity. So anyway, all just to
Thank
say,
you.
basically, I'm a big fan, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Right on. Thank you.
So to answer your question, does my family think I'm crazy? I would say in a lot of ways, yes. But in the last few years, it's kind of interesting because actually they've become more aware, as a lot of people have, of the conspiratorial nature of different events playing out and different organizations involved and behind a lot of those events that maybe guys like me and you and a lot of the people that we're aware of are kind of already in tune with. But it's just becoming, I think, to the point where it's so obvious now that a lot of people are coming over to those things that were once considered crazy. But yeah, so I guess like my immediate family, at least, I'd say our biggest differences in the craziness in regards to what they might think about me is more in regards to maybe my spirituality. So like in the spiritual sector of things, they're very rigid, I'd say, in their versions of their particular form of Christianity. For example, I myself, I'm more in alignment with, I guess I would call it like an esoteric Christian leaning, that kind of approach. And it's not really something that's easy for them to wrap their mind around, I guess. So they probably think I'm a little bit crazy in that regard, but they're well intended, and they're still extremely supportive of me in general in life. So I try and kind of honor them and focus on that, and versus focusing too much on the fact that they think that if I don't accept their version of Christianity, then I'm basically bound to eternal damnation.
Right.
But yeah, it's kind of, I don't know. I think all of this stuff is fascinating, and I keep my mind pretty open and flexible, and I try to, if I have the energy, maybe present a little bit of this information to my family if it's something I feel is in the right timing and whatnot. But I'm sure you know how that all is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, wow. So I guess now I should kind of ask you, when did this all begin for you? I mean, you've been doing your show since 2019. You've been probably researching this stuff far longer than that. So how did this all start for you? When did your journey into, the unconventional and the unknown start?
Well, I would say it's probably been a while. I mean, I could remember being in high school and just being obsessively researching things like George Bush and Dick Cheney and different things going on with like the opium trade in Afghanistan, and kind of going down rabbit holes on the internet and coming to my own conclusions on that stuff, researching like satellite surveillance technologies. And I don't know, I've kind of always just been interested in the world and the possibilities of what's going on, what's real, what's not, what constitutes reality. And the podcast kind of, I guess it was inspired from a lot of different podcasts. I mean, obviously, Joe Rogan is a huge inspiration for me. I've been listening to him for a long time now. Um, Sam Tripoli, obviously, is a great influence on me. Shout out to him. You know, guys like Greg Carlwood over there at the Higher Side Chats. I definitely draw a lot of inspiration from him as well. Duncan Trussell, kind of just listening to a lot of different podcasts and just becoming so interested in kind of wanting to ask my own questions, I guess. And I remember actually I was influenced at one point by something that Sam had said a while ago. I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago in his podcast. And he was getting some criticism and like feedback about people saying, why do you do your podcast? Or I mean, why don't you do your podcast this way? Or why don't you have on this guy? And I can't believe you didn't ask this question or la, 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 la. So he was just talking about that. And he's like, dude, start your own podcast. Like, if you're going to criticize my podcast and, you know, as him being someone that's, you know, doing what they're doing and having somebody come and criticize you and try to improve what you're doing, when that's a person that's typically not even doing anything or contributing anything. And I think that kind of was hitting me in a certain way because I've often had those questions of like, oh, I wish that he would have asked this, or I wish that he would interview this guest. And then I'm like, dude, that's like my inspiration. Like, I'm just going to start my own podcast. And it's typically, it's not really my comfort zone. Like public speaking in general, it has never really been something I felt comfortable with, but I knew that there's definitely a lot of value in at least challenging myself and trying to overcome those particular obstacles. And I knew that I was going to get a lot out of it, going to be able to talk to the people that I wanted to talk to and ask the questions I wanted to ask. So that was, I guess, how it all started. Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, definitely. As both of us were inspired by Sam, I took that same kind of impetus. Like, not every guest is going to be the right fit for Sam's show and vice versa, it's kind of funny because you went more gung ho than me in the sense that you were like, well, I'm just going to start my own podcast. Me, I was insane enough to think that I could actually tell Sam who to interview. And yeah, I remember listening to Sam's show a bunch and thinking like, oh, if only he knew this, or if only he talked to this guy. So I ended up, buying a ticket to one of his shows in New York. And I've told this story before. If you've heard my podcast, you might have heard me talk about it. But I gave him a copy of the Kabbalion, which is like the seven Hermetic principles. And it was around the same time that others had kind of brought that up to him as well. So it was a good fit. And then, one thing led to another. And Sam asked me to help him find guests for his new podcast, Zero. And I kind of had that same instinct of like, well, if I'm going to be working for Sam, I should have my own podcast. I can't just like live vicariously through his podcasts. And yeah, it's kind of cool that it all unfolded. You were ahead of the curve, though. I think you kind of like sensed something because you started your show in 2019, which was right before the proverbial shit hit the fan. And yeah, I mean, what was that like? Because me, I started in fall 2020, so we had already kind of experienced some of the pandemic. But what was that like?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it was sort of a sense of things, and it was just something I was actually sitting on it for probably 2 or 3 years before I actually began to do it because I didn't want to do it in a crappy way. And I'm aware, listen to different people talk about the statistics of, people often when they start podcasts, they don't get past their eighth episode or whatever it is statistically. And I was like, I don't want to be that person. If I want to do it, I want to be consistent. And honestly, kudos to you in that regard because you started later than me and you're killing it. Like your consistency is insane, and you're pumping out like content that's not only consistent, but it's also great on top of it. So
Thank you.
like I, as a podcaster, I know how much work goes into all of that, especially when you're doing things yourself. And so I can recognize how much time and work that you put into
Mm.
your podcast. And on top of it, you're booking all the stuff for Sam. So yeah, it's kind of blows my mind. And I, I'm someone that personally I learn more in terms of listening versus if I'm like reading something.
Mm.
Not to say that that's necessarily better, because if like an EMP bomb hit or some shit like that, I wouldn't be as useful. So, but I do wish I did have a better capacity at actually like reading information, but then my brain just kind of turns off and I fall asleep. So I love consuming and listening to audio, and
Mm.
there's just a lot of subjects and topics out there that I want to exhume and explore and go into more, not only for myself but for others, because it's what I wish that I had, and that's kind of another motivation behind it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I gotta say, I've been listening to your show for a little while now, and you're doing a great job yourself. I love the sound. I love the caliber of guests you get on. You've had some really interesting conversations from uh, this most recent episode, which I checked out. I don't remember the gentleman's name off the top of my head. Here it is, Timothy Hogan, and you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about some, well, Templars, and this crosses paths with some stuff I've been researching, and yeah, I'm curious when it comes to uh, Freemasonry, Templars. This sort of more like. I guess civilian aspect of secret societies, they're a little more in reach. Anyone can kind of join them, so to speak. What are your thoughts on that? Are you yourself initiated? Would you get initiated, or are you interested in that kind of stuff? To like me, to just kind of know without having to take any oaths. Like, what's your stance on that?
Well, okay, so this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, I guess I'd say. Yeah, with the whole, secret society thing, which, they're not all so secret. I guess esoteric orders is a word that I like to use in regards to a lot of these things, but the majority of them, I mean, I was interested in the good and the bad, just knowing what's going on, knowing what are they up to, who are they, having skepticism, especially like early on, being really hesitant and skeptical with, you know, things like Freemasonry, just personally, because I didn't know much about it. It was super mysterious, like many of these things are. And so I basically made it my part of my podcasting mission, I guess, one of many, to explore and dive into some of these things and try to find people who actually are initiates within these orders. And I've probably interviewed almost a person in almost every, at least familiar, popular order that there is, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, Templars, Golden Dawn initiates, the AA, former, current people within different intelligence agencies, all of it. And I'm curious, and I want to know, is it good? Is it bad? Or what are they up to? Like,
Mm.
and from what I've found, is that it was actually pretty surprising. Most of them, from what I can tell, are pretty good systems of what I find to be sort of alchemical, uh, spiritual purification practices. Maybe things like Freemasonry. From a lot of the Freemasons I talked to, one in particular that I love his perspective on. Jamie Paul Lamb, he talks about it as speculative temple building,
Mm.
and he kind of talks about it in regards to uh, applying temple building in terms of like the internal and like building your internal temple. And it's actually a very like moral and ethical, virtuous system of initiatic ritual, so to speak. So it's like you're going through these, and I don't know. I'm not initiated into Freemasonry. I'm actually interested though, and I may eventually be. But from what my understanding is that it's a system that's bringing you into a more deeper understanding with these things like the virtues. There's things like building a memory temple, which are fascinating to me. Which you could research with guys like Leonardo de Bruno or whatever. And I don't know. I find it like it's a very healthy thing, and I almost feel at this point like it might be things like Freemasonry, maybe these other orders as well. They may be part of the cure in terms of like where we're at as a society and some of the pitfalls and the place that we find ourselves in terms of like we have it seems almost as if we've lost a lot of our moral and ethical values, and we're really a lot of people are getting just to this place of almost adopting extreme materialist viewpoints on reality, and I think
Mm,
that's to our detriment. And I think it's just due to a lot of it's due to a lot of a lack of understanding and lack of education around these sort of things. So, yeah, with that being said, also, I did and I have joined the Templar Collegia, which that is the order that you may have heard Timothy Hogan talk about on that interview that we did, which is considered the outer order of the inner order, which is the Temple of Secret Initiates. So I guess I can't speak to that part until I get there. But with the outer order, basically there's a curriculum or certain texts that are basically there as a preparatory measure to kind of get you in alignment with sort of the topics and subject matters that you're going into. And yeah, that's kind of, I guess, my response to that question.
I love it. Yeah, what a great place to start this conversation, man. I find myself sort of in a position, a dualistic position with secret societies because, you know, on the one hand, I've read books like The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth or The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And these books describe the esoteric studies as like a lost key to our true spiritual understanding, overstanding knowledge base, right? They talk about how, there's sort of a priest class that's maybe separated this structure of ideas from the masses, and over time religion's kind of done this, and now we have secret societies that seemingly continue these practices, right, as you described. And then on the other hand, at the same time, contemporary secret societies like the one I've been looking into at Yale, Skull and Bones, which sort of you can consider it like a mystery school in the sense that like all of these secret societies at Yale are like initiating the students into their adulthood, like a rite of passage and a sort of like secret, very rarefied and elite group of people. But when you look at the track record and the alumni, they're clearly the movers and shakers. I mean, from oil to the automobile to banking and everything in between, even the military industrial complex. And I wonder if, as somebody who's clearly taken a lot of time to speak to these folks and also learn as much as you can, like, do you think that there's a sort of delineation or a hierarchy, maybe like opposing factions? Because, we hear this term secret societies, and you and I both know that's a term that means a bunch of different groups, hundreds possibly. So, like, with that in mind, like, have you spoken to anybody on your show that kind of gave you a bad vibe and you're like, all right, I wouldn't join this one?
Well, I've spoken to some people that I wouldn't say that they've given me a bad vibe in terms of they had bad intentions, but maybe some individuals where they ended up, I wasn't the best place. And actually, that's more in regards to, I would say, things in the alchemical realm, which are independent of particular orders like we're talking about. But I actually did want, that's something I, when I had reached out to you a while back, I did want to kind of talk to you about that because I do agree with you. And I think that things like Skull and Bones and some of these societies, maybe, I don't know, maybe you could relate it to like groups. I don't know, maybe they're not considered secret societies, but like the, the Bilderberg Group or the Trilateral Commission or Council on Foreign Relations or, these sort of organizations seem like they're up to more negative, power seeking,
Like political,
control
more
sort
political
of.
in nature.
Yeah, and from my perspective, as far as the people I've talked to and my investigations, things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which there are many actual lineages of. People don't really consider that. There's not just one lineage. It's not all necessarily uniform. But things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or Freemasonry, which I guess Freemasonry would be another one. There's like the Scottish Rite, there's the Blue Lodge, uh, there's different there's differences from the United States to like Italian Freemasonry to it's different around the world. I don't know how much exactly because I'm not an expert really in that regard. But yeah, as far as the ones that I have inquired into, they are not necessarily up to anything nefarious. They're more about refining and purifying the individual, and it's almost like a very advanced self-help community sort
Well,
of thing, I guess.
and that's exactly, I mean, as you were describing the temple building, the inner temple, uh, that's exactly what Manly P. Hall sort of, I mean, I don't think he says it outright, maybe he does, but it's implied that, when they're talking about a temple and building the perfect temple, whether it's a physical temple or a human temple, they say they're building it within the proportions of a man, right? And you could see that in some of these, proper cathedrals and temples built with this in mind. So it stands to reason that there would be this sort of exoteric interpretation where people are like, oh yeah, they're just talking about making the perfect building and this is the right way to do it, and of course it's going to reflect the creator, which is us and the creator above, right? Where that's the whole point of the golden ratio and using these mathematics. But it definitely, it definitely feels, I guess the part where the average, maybe like more conspiracy oriented person takes umbrage with it is like the exclusivity of it. And I guess maybe my question then to you is, do you think the exclusivity is about keeping certain people out, or is it more about like finding the right people and having to kind of prove yourself, like having that inlaid test in order to, kind of demonstrate that you're worthy of the knowledge that you'll receive after initiation?
I would definitely say the latter. And I actually have had exact thoughts that you're speaking to in that regard. And there's like, it's like, why, you wonder to yourself, like, why are they so secretive, or why are these groups not so open to everybody? And I feel like it's the conclusion that I've come to is that it's, you don't necessarily want just complete open borders with something like, with a system that you want to keep pure in a way that is going to facilitate and instigate a particular change within somebody else. And for, like within some of these orders, you can choose to be public and put yourself out there, let it be known. It's not like you're not allowed to do so. There's many people that do, but they do protect people that choose to be private, and they they don't want to expose those people, from my understanding, because the society that we're in, and I know this, firsthand just from my life experience with, um, kind of speaking to my like first statements when you were asking me about does my family think I'm crazy. Um, there's a very dominant, there are very dominant, quote unquote, I guess, egregores that are pervasive, that frown upon or judge, or maybe subconsciously would seek to attack and dismantle uh, certain things of this nature, because people are in masses and within a lot of religious sects are afraid of the unknown, and they're afraid of the quote unquote occult. And I was myself, and but I had the, I guess, curiosity enough to know that maybe it's just something that I'm not aware of, and maybe I wonder if there's more to this thing, and am I being fearful for what reasons? What am I basing it off of? Like, when I think of people being hesitant and fearful of Freemasonry, for example, I think I brought this up. Actually, I did an interview with Juan, the one-on-one podcast, recently, and I was talking about, like, statistically the different groups, like, maybe like police officers or different groups and organizations and societal roles that have way more of a proclivity to engage in harmful acts or abuse their power or do unethical and immoral behaviors. And then you compare that and you cross reference that with what you can find on people that are involved in things like Freemasonry. And honestly, it's pretty small. And I'm not saying that there are no examples of that, because there are. And I have discussed those, and I've covered things like, I think it was like the P2 Lodge in particular. And I think that was in, maybe Italy, somewhere in Europe.
Yeah, it was in Italy.
Yeah, okay. So, there are definitely examples of individuals within some of these groups taking advantage or using these systems and these structures to their benefit for nefarious purposes. And my point was with that is that's going to happen in almost every organization, because humans are humans, just like it happens in churches, just like it happens in police departments. But we shouldn't dismantle police departments. We shouldn't dismantle churches. We shouldn't prevent people from being able to seek and engage in the religious experiences that they wish to engage in, so long as it's not harming anybody else. It's more about, if there are negative and unethical and immoral behaviors or acts occurring within any institution, obviously, at least I'm aligned with the fact that we should be going after that and we should be fighting that. But in large, it's not occurring so much within these things like Freemasonry or these orders. And I think that if people would be more less to judge and less to assume, less quick to assume things about what they think they might know based off of something they may have heard, then they would come to find that that's the case. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, well, you got us in the right place. I think you did answer the question. I think when it comes to these orders, these groups, you can't judge them all whole cloth as one thing, right? And you make the great point that humans are gonna human. They're gonna do what humans have done in time immemorial, or at least that's what we're told. I think part of what has always allured or drawn me into the subculture, the hidden culture of secret societies, is that idea that we can make the world a better place. Maybe I'm just another dreamer millennial who thinks that I can make a difference, but
I'm with you.
when it comes to these secret societies, that's kind of what it feels like. Is like the idea is that you sort of draw in people who may or may not have the necessary skills that when, bolstered by this sound teaching that's been demonstrated for many centuries, it feels to me like we have a sort of an equation for some really amazing things to occur, and then in the transverse of that, you'd have possibly some people who see that format and think, okay, well, we could just do this but for a very selfish purpose, and it may work just as well, right? Because we live in this
Definitely.
free will universe. But when it comes to the esoteric studies, in the same way that we have a kind of like the esoteric builder allegory mentality, of building the perfect temple, there's also the alchemy, right? The alchemy that most people, if you did one of these on the street polls, they would say something about lead to gold if they even knew what alchemy was. And that's, again, this kind of exoteric exterior sort of interpretation of something that is a lot more profound. It's incredible that it may be possible. And I've spoken just this week. George Wiseman, inventor of the aqua cure, claimed, he
Yeah.
said, that alchemy, turning other base metals into gold, is possible. He says that's possible, and I think we
Totally.
should trust him because he's invented a couple things, not just one thing. But either way, take that or leave it. There's something deeper, more profound behind alchemy that's behind this sort of allegory. And it feels to me like this is the theme to your show in a way, right? Of course, you have this interest in secret societies and interviewing people who are initiated into certain orders. You've spoken to a bunch of really brilliant authors as well, guys like Mark Stavish. And I'm, curious when it comes to, alchemy. Are you pursuing your own sort of personal, let's say, transmutation of lead to gold?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, yeah, for first to kind of speak to your initial comments when you were beginning speaking, uh, I have a friend which I actually just interviewed recently. We did an episode on esoteric Christianity. He's a temple chief of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and it's interesting because you'll find a lot of people will criticize and talk about, you know, fellas like Aleister Crowley, which I think totally valid, and they might think that there are not other people that think the ways that they do within these societies, and he's a primary example of that person. And he talks about how he doesn't really care for much for Aleister Crowley, yet he is a temple chief of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and that kind of comes to the whole thing with different lineages. And it's not necessarily that just because you're in one of these orders, that does not mean that you adopt the attitudes, behaviors, or uh, previous perspectives of anybody who was previous to you. But yeah, anyway, so he kind of talks about how a lot of people these days, the problem is that they're drawn to the occult for the wrong reasons. Like you were saying, like that maybe they want power or they want to control things, and it's coming from a bad place. But at the same time, maybe those are the perfect people to be drawn towards these orders, because if you join one of these orders and go through it, maybe that will refine that lead into gold, like we're talking about. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, and it's the subject of alchemy. 100%. That's one of the main themes of my podcast, and that subject is so broad and so fascinating, and there's so many questions that I have since I've come across it. I've wanted answered, and I've wanted to pierce into it, and I could never find, or many of the things I wanted to know, it was so difficult to find. So I just started going and prying and finding the people. And I feel like now I've developed a pretty good network of people all over the world that are legitimate practicing alchemists, both within and without, in terms of internal as well as external alchemy, because there is both. And I try not to focus on one more than the other. I try to include both because I think that is alchemical, as above, so below, as within, so without. Don't just be as above, don't just be as below, don't just be as within, and don't just be as without. Be all of it. And that's like when it comes to reality and truth and discerning truth and finding out what's what and what is reality, because obviously everybody experiences it differently, and it seems like there's definitely universal laws though that govern it, and the alchemists are the ones that are in touch with that. They're in touch with learning and seeking to understand the laws of nature, and that's what I want to learn. And I think like what I've come to be super interested in, because I was early on, I don't know if it's through exploring alchemy or physics or what, but I kept coming up against like the ether of things, and guys like Tesla that or even Einstein. You'd talk about like the luminiferous ether, and you'd find a lot of the smartest people, they were always including the word ether or aether in terms of the things that they were talking about. I was like, what is the aether? What is the ether? What are the ethers? Because there are more than one ether. I ended up finding some great resources and people and books that would help explain that. And this is also it's alchemy as well. But it's like in terms of like what is reality or how does reality work, like from the people that I've talked to in my explorations into alchemy and talking with physicists and alchemists and different people in different orders, um it comes down to like a lot of things like nested ethers that build on each other, and then in between those ethers there's like nested cycles of creation and then rest, and there's like manvantaras, the durations of times, and then pralayas, like these pauses uh of time or creation, and then there's like the yuga cycles that are like nested within those, and there's like the Kali Yuga, and potentially we're entering into the what was it, Satya Yuga or something along those lines. But these ethers, coming back to those, it's so fascinating because this is like one thing that I feel is most occulted or has been most occulted, and not a lot of people talk about or know how to talk about. And I myself, I'm probably not going to do it nearly as much justice as I could, but I'll attempt to kind of poke at it. Um, so we have like within the ethers, the four primary ethers. There's the warmth ether, the light ether, the sound ether, and the life ether. And these, they're pretty much synonymous with the Hindu tattvas. They're like the building blocks of the universe, so to speak. And like um, the word or the word of God is like life made manifest by the evolution of the preceding ethers. And the substance in which these are formed is what we would call like the Akasha, the Akashic mother. And they're kind of like the energetic background formative forces that have a conjugate relationship with the four elements of fire, air, water, and earth in the alchemical sense. And there's also like a sort of greater dipole or conjugate of like fixity and volatility within all of it. And this might be confusing, but I'll try to like explain. So if you take the coupling of like the ether of warmth with the element of fire, it's like a coupling. And then you also the coupling of air with the element of light. Those all together sort of reflect the volatile aspects of nature. Alchemically, they'd be like correlative with what's called the celestial niter, and the forces of like levity and their nature is more electric. And then we have like the fixed aspects, or the celestial salt. That would be more like the gravitational forces and the magnetic nature of things, corresponding with the elements and ethers, um, which we'd have like the coupling of sound and water, and life and earth. And I don't know, maybe you've heard of like the alchemical principles of salt, sulfur, and mercury. So there's a bunch of diagrams online that show like the relations of the different elements with the three principles, and how they kind of like go into each other, and how the elements make up the principles. So like, I don't know if congelation is the right word, but you would have air and fire that are they make up the sulfur aspect, and then you'd have air and water that make up the mercury aspect. Water and earth would make up the salt aspect, and it's kind of one of those like as within so without aspects of alchemical understanding, because all things in reality can be broken down into the salt and the sulfur and mercury, and it's just a language thing, so it's confusing when we hear it like that: salt, sulfur, and mercury. But what that means is the soul, which is the sulfur, the spirit, which is the mercury, and the body, which is the salt. So, we're all familiar usually with that trinity of like that soul, spirit, and body. And so alchemy is fascinating and so amazing and so awesome, because it is something that you can do in your reality practically, operatively, and apply it to matter, and then gain the understanding of these higher order principles by doing and demonstrating it in your actual reality. So like in the plant kingdom, like the soul being the essence or the essential oils within a plant. And then so you'd get that out, and then you could ferment the plant, and then eventually it'll break down into an alcohol or a spirit. And you can get that out, and then what you have left is the residual plant matter, or the body of the plant. And then you calcine that, you burn it, you put it through the fire, you reduce it to a pure white ash with very high temperatures. You dissolve it in distilled water and evaporate it with either distilled water or a hydrosol, and you end up with a pure crystal body. And the recombination of all these things is what's called a spagyric, and that's like an alchemical preparation. That's a medicine, and you can do this with the plant kingdom, with the animal kingdom, with the mineral kingdom, with rocks. They're rocks and minerals. Crystals, it's a little different because there's processes of like or what is it? Catalytic conversion reactions that you have to do. But yeah, I mean, everything reduces down to these three principles, and that's kind of just an explanation that can give people a little bit of insight into why things like alchemy and alchemical understandings are so valuable. And they're also a metaphor for life, because all of these things can be applied to the human being. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Well said, man. Thank you. And there's so many parallels, from the Trinity of Christianity to the doshas of I think it's Ayurvedic medicine. Is it? I think they're all called doshas, unless that's just one of them. But and then I'm sure Chinese medicine has its parallels as well. But yeah, it's fascinating. Your point about being able to re-examine the world around you from this point of view, and from a certain perspective that's magical, and I think people today, unfortunately, they're drawn to like this materialist nihilism that you were describing before. And if secret societies are the solution to that, I'm with you, man. I think that's a really incredible thing. you know you mentioned before, this sort of esoteric Christian perspective that you hold, and people often think, well, you know, esotericism, the occult, those are not on the same side as Christianity, where there may be some esoteric Christian books that, I don't know where you stand on them because sometimes they can be controversial, but it seems like we've been given, even with Christianity, this sort of materialistic, nihilistic, maybe it's not so nihilistic as it is sort of authoritarian. And, I think it's definitely, it's something that people take for granted, when they go. I was raised in a Catholic church, so when I'm sitting in, the pews, we're seeing them hold an incense and wave that around and do this whole ritual. And as a kid, you're just like, what's going on? I don't understand. It's in Latin. Maybe that's on purpose so that you don't understand. But with this alchemical perspective, you might imagine that that incense is a part of what that would be, like the sulfur, right? Or would that be, because there's the holy oil that they sprinkle, so that would be the oil part of it, which I think you said was the sulfur. So I'm getting
Mhm.
him confused, but one of them is, the incense must represent one of those as well, and I'm sure the wine or the water or whatever has its place as well. But yeah, that might not ring any bells. I don't know how many Catholics are out there in the in Arizona, but maybe.
Definitely. Yeah, I would regard that more along the lines of with the soul, as it's the soul is being emitted, and that's the aroma that you're
Mm,
intaking. You're
right,
intaking and inhaling the essence of that thing.
right.
Um, and there's also, you talk to guys, you may have heard of like Phoenix Aurelius. He's an alchemist. I think that Sam's interviewed him as
Yeah, yeah.
well. Yeah, he talks about like the fixed and volatile aspects of the soul,
Mm,
so you can kind of like break it down further, and then how that relates to material realm of things when you're doing operative lab work, and how that translates into the your human life, and like the characteristics of your being and what colors your personality. And he'll talk about like the tincture of a plant, and like the tincture or the color of your personality, and these are like corresponding sort of ways of communicating the same principles.
mm.
But
See, now that I feel like you're sort of answering my next question, which is, it can't be one size fits all, right? That's sort of the purpose of understanding the different, qualities of different plants, and maybe, a certain solution or spagyric potion is right for you at a certain moment, depending on what's going on, alchemically within you, right? It's not just sort of
totally,
a one size fits all kind of process.
yeah, and like you talk to some guys and they're just so they go so deep into the different possibilities within how to attune a particular preparation towards an individual's particular needs. And it could be both a physical thing as well as a conscious thing, because, with the alchemical understanding, it's like the as within, so without principle, something that's troublesome internally may potentially manifest externally, and something that has manifested externally may be a product of something that is repressed or suppressed internally. And so there's all kinds of philosophy behind why and how all of this works, and what medicinal preparations are conducive towards treating particular ailments mentally and physically, um, within regards to all that. And there's, so many interesting individuals that can go way deeper into all that than
Well,
myself. But
and I was gonna ask you that because we're just podcasters. We're not writing books about alchemy or anything like that. Maybe you are. I haven't mentioned that, but we both interviewed Brian Cote Noir, who's
oh, okay,
written a
yeah.
book called Practical Alchemy, and
Hmm.
yeah, I guess aside from him, are there anyone else that you've interviewed that you would recommend for people whose curiosity has been piqued? Anybody who you consider sort of like the go-to for this subject?
Oh man, I could go all day on that. Let's see.
Maybe good starters for people, not like the deep end of the pool. Maybe the low end of the pool.
Well, some of my favorite that kind of cross the bridge between the, the being a good communicator. I would say Daniel Wiseman is fantastic. He's a guy out of Nova Scotia. His apothecary is called Secret Fire Apothecary, and he's just a super amazing communicator, and he has a way of being able to explain a lot of these things that's understandable for guys that maybe not familiar.
Mm.
And okay, so I'd say him. Phoenix is awesome. He can go deep, he can go shallow, he can go
Mm.
all
Yeah, I
over.
was gonna say we've established he's deep end. I've heard enough from him.
Yeah.
I love him. I think he's a great guest. I haven't had him on this show yet. I should though,
Yeah,
actually, as
you
a matter
should
of
for
fact,
sure.
especially after this.
Any people I have, love to and I'd be happy to put you in contact
Oh,
with anybody.
likewise, likewise.
Yeah. Uh there's a great dude. His language style is a little less comprehensive, I'd say, but I love him. He's one of the best. His name is Roger Lambert. He's super advanced. He's on the ball. You got, of course, I'm sure that you've heard. Uh, why am I drawing a blank right now? One of Daniel's teachers, actually, one of a lot of people I've learned from him. Robert Allen Bartlett. I think he wrote the book Real Alchemy. He's awesome. He can definitely go over the basics of things with people, and he delivers it in a pretty comprehensive way.
Well, I think
If you want to get crazy, you want to talk to somebody about animal alchemy.
okay, yeah, I love that.
Uh, Israel Ruiz is his name, or he goes by Raven. He gets wild. Talking to him, I always compare it to like almost being on a psychedelic because he's just out there in the best way possible.
That's awesome. Well, and
um,
another person who maybe this wouldn't be considered alchemy, but I think I mentioned him already, Mark Stavish. And
mhm.
you mentioned the term egregore, but you used it in an interesting way, and I want to ask you about that. You said that certain people they may get drawn to like the egregore of judgment or the egregore of shame, and I
Mhm.
imagine maybe the egregore of fear or anger, right? Like, are we talking about like emotions that get charged to a point where they sort of
Mm.
attach to like ideas? Because I'm familiar with what an
Well,
egregore is, but
I would
explain.
I would say that the emotional aspects are aspects of an egregore. I wouldn't necessarily say that they themselves are the egregore. Like I wouldn't say fear is an egregore, or uh love is an egregore, or
Okay.
I wouldn't say that, but I would say there are egregores that perpetuate fear, or
Right.
there
Right.
are egregores that perpetuate love. In terms of an egregore, I would think it's almost, I mean, I guess technically, from my understanding, an egregore is just a thought form that's shared by multiple individuals, and it's almost like you're creating, or something is created that is like not tangible necessarily in terms of like a physical tangibility, but a psychic tangibility. Like a maybe imagine it as like a psychic cloud of potency, and some egregores can be more potent than others. And like when I talked to Mark, he would even say like uh, the the sort of um, egregore of being affected by a football team. If you're somebody who's into football, or you're somebody who's into sports, and there's this massive psychic field of energy, of thought energy, that goes into maybe the people that you're around that are rooting for this team, and they're getting super charged up. There's this a potent egregore that's like a um it's like a psychic field almost that is influential,
Could it be
and
like
it's
a
it's
around a
shared.
Could it be like around a band, even like, a
Totally.
sports
Absolutely.
team, a band, something like even a podcast might have
Podcast,
an
a logo,
egregore.
a sigil, a logo,
Right.
um,
Wow.
an item. It's something that's shared though, primarily.
Mm,
The main aspect of an egregore is that it's something that's, from my understanding, it's shared by multiple individuals. So it's like a um it's not it's not an individual thought form, it's a shared thought form.
right.
And there's good egregores and there's bad egregores and there's potent egregores and there are weak egregores, and yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of my understanding.
Yeah. Well, and I think like, obvious ones would probably be like Christ, Buddha,
Mm.
Muhammad,
Oh, I,
Moses or Abraham.
yeah, I wanted to actually, because something you said earlier, I forgot I was going to mention, because you mentioned uh, I think you mentioned the esoteric Christianity thing.
Mm,
And I think this is something that's developed for me over time in terms of my understanding of it. And I think another great person on this, you may have interviewed him, Ian Ferguson.
mm,
Also, he's a member of the Templar Collegiate as well. Um, we had a great conversation about similar things in regards to which maybe we differ a little bit on a couple aspects, but I think that when I think about esoteric Christianity, and this is, I'm sure it's a way deeper subject for more people, uh, for other people than maybe I'm gonna display it or put it out there as. So I don't want to be like saying that I'm representing the full totality of what it is or anything like that. But I did an episode with this guy Ike Baker. He's great about that. But it's kind of like the idea of you're not so much, the important aspects of Christianity are not so much the factual or historical accuracy of things. It's more about the message and the importance of what's intended to be conveyed by the texts and the archetypal transmission that is intended to be conveyed by the text, like the meaning, the actual meaning, versus, because people debate and they argue all day about, um, was Jesus a real person? Was he not? Was he real? Was he fake? And it's like, I'm at the point where I don't care whether he was or wasn't. I think he may have been. Maybe he totally could have been real. He totally could have been a made up story. That's not what's the important message behind the story, in my opinion. And that, I think, is like a form of, maybe that's a form of esoteric Christianity. Maybe, I mean, there's probably a lot deeper perspectives on that when you look at the different parables of the Bible and what they can convey. That's probably a whole nother important esoteric aspect of these texts, is the messages behind the parables and what's intended to be communicated in terms of archetypal transmissions for those who have ears to see and eyes to hear. And the I don't know where I was going exactly with that, but the whole idea of like getting super hung up on the historicity of things is almost getting to the point where it's just so silly to me. Like I don't think that that is, whether Jesus the figure did exist or didn't exist. I don't think that's important. And then when I talk to guys like Ian Ferguson, I love that he emphasizes the middle, like the middle way of things, or the Christ path, or the Christ principle of things, or maybe some would say the Christ consciousness. And to me, it seems like that's all about, you're not being so far over in the materialistic realm of things, and you're not being so far over in the complete spiritual realm of things where you're ignoring the physicality of where you're at and the physical manifestation of where you're at, but you're trying to balance and harmonize with both, and you're finding yourself in the place that you are. And it's like, it's, to me, that's what represents the way, or the middle path, or the Christ consciousness. It's like with anything, you could apply it to politics, you could apply it to um, decisions that you're making about life, you can apply it to anything. It's like don't go to one extreme or the other. Give yourself a balanced perspective and a balanced look at things. Like, oh, I think that this was something I brought up on a podcast that hasn't been released yet with Ike Baker on his podcast, but we were getting into in terms of like things like right now there's this whole kind of back and forth debate about like feminism or masculinity and all of this, and they're like polarities, and there's a lot of women out there, men too, that feel like there's been a patriarchy that has been dominant for so much time, and they want to go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and they want it to be only women can lead, men can't lead, only women can lead. That's what it should be. And it's like, no, now you're going to the way to the other extreme. Like, don't go from one extreme to the other and overcorrect. Like, the goal is to like nor women nor men, both. Like, the point is that both are valid and both should be recognized and appreciated for what they are. And that, to me, like that whole understanding is like the Christ or Christian, in my opinion. That's like what it means to align with the Christ principle.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you on the point of polarity. It's, not about sort of getting retribution by swinging to the next polarity. You got to find balance, right? I think that's the middle path, and the that's the Tao.
And in alchemy, like Daniel Wiseman would say, he would say, this is where you're volatilizing the fixed and fixing the volatile.
Mm.
So it's like, the goal is this harmonious balance of both. And that's what you want to take in, because that's where the medicine's at.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, man. Well said. And I really appreciate you taking us through your knowledge base, and alchemy is clearly something that's important to you, and I feel like it's something that I definitely haven't put as much, let's say, practice into, like normal, let's say, by the books alchemy. But when I was a martial artist, uh, I felt like there was this sort of psychosomatic connection that was being forged. And, this is between the ages of like 14 and 24. This is primarily when I was doing martial arts. And, anything you do at that age is going to stick with you for a while, especially if it's something, constructive. And there's a sort of physical alchemy that takes place with forging that connection between mind and body. It doesn't have to just be martial arts. It could be really any sport that, pushes you to that. But yeah, I wonder, when it comes to, alchemy, where do you apply it in your own life, aside from, through this excellent podcast of yours, and through, the conversations you take place in?
Yeah. Well, I would first and foremost just say that, yeah, I totally think that that is a form of alchemy, as many things are that people may not even recognize day to day. And I think the goal, or the great thing about alchemy, is to realize the things that, how you can apply alchemy to everything in life, because there are alchemies, and it's like the art of alchemy is the art of the processes of creativity and creation, and carrying out um, development developmental processes of life. And you can apply it to your life, you can apply it to matter, you can apply it to a skill. And so I'd say, like, for myself, my day-to-day job, I run and operate a CNC machine. That's my day job. I'm a CNC operator. That's one of the things that I do. And I think about it all the time when I'm doing it, because it's like I'm, I have this machine that I need to calibrate, and I have to keep these bits at a certain depth so that they are very precise in the way that they cut at a certain depth, so they don't go too deep, so that they don't go too high. Um, I got to change out the bits when they are starting to chip the material. So it's like all about, I'm trying to facilitate this process of my craft. And this could apply to any craft, whether you're a woodworker, whether you're an electrician, whether you're a plumber, whatever it is, your craft. And I think this is also maybe reflected in things like Freemasonry that we spoke about earlier, but it's about trying to do what you do and do it well and refine it and purify it and get it to an exalted state of, you could say, perfection. And when you say perfection, it's like, oh my gosh, whoa, you're holding me to this high standard, but that's like something to aspire towards. It's not necessarily that you're like having to do that, but it's like the aspiration towards perfection or the aspiration towards the greatest good that you can do. It's like being the best that you can be and understanding the processes of how to get there and understanding how to refine and how to distill your knowledge and purify what you have at hand and create the best possible outcome that's going to produce the best possible results. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I mean, martial arts, you can possibly interpret that as a craft, but yeah, maybe podcasting is my craft. I'm
Totally.
pretty good with my hands, so I don't know. I probably need to pick up another skill some point in my as I get older here. But wow, man, I really love this alchemy conversation. I do want to pivot back to Templars though, because this is a fascinating group. I know,
I agree.
as far as secret societies today go, um, not only are there like modern groups that identify as Templars through name, but I think some Freemasonic organizations trace their lineage back to the Templars, or at least give like some sort of kind of like historical credit to the Templars. And I'm wondering, for you, how far do you venture into like the historical Templars, and you know as far as that's concerned, I mean, for you, because there's a lot. I mean, from Oak Island to the Ark of the Covenant. I mean,
Yes.
it is everything that's said about the Templars true, or do you think it's just sort of like the byproduct of what happens when secret societies form and people generate rumors about them?
Well, I have not yet concluded my thoughts on that, and I am in as much investigation as you probably are within all that. And I totally, like, it's fascinating to me because I've read so many different accounts from so many different individuals on their perspectives. And I think I had listened to one of the episodes that you recently did with the guy that was talking about some Templar stuff as well. And then, I've interviewed the people that I've interviewed and I've talked to the people that I've talked to. And you do find these kind of like incongruencies potentially, and it makes you wonder about things. So I haven't necessarily drawn any conclusions, but I have, in terms of like my conversations with Tim Hogan in particular, I've listened to what he said, and what he said is compelling and it is possible and plausible. So I do entertain it as a possibility. I obviously don't know. I can't say that I know things because I wasn't there to experience things. But from his perspective, in terms of the lineage that he comes from, well, according to him, he comes from multiple lineages, and there are multiple lineages of Templarism. And like you had mentioned, within Freemasonry, I think there is a branch of, I don't know if it's a degree or how that necessarily works, but there is like a Templar degree or something along those lines. Not really quite sure what that means exactly, but there is some connection there. And then there are various lineages of Templar organizations, from what I understand, and some of them are in congruency with each other, and maybe some aren't. I've also had friends that have told me that people have come to them that claimed to have been Templars and tried to initiate them that maybe weren't even necessarily related to anything real. So it's like maybe there's groups or societies or something out there posing and portraying themselves as Templars that is totally separate potentially. Um, but yeah, like when I talked to Tim, I think he was speaking to the notion that he had been initiated into a variety of different lineages that, and then he gave like the background context going historically, if you want to speak historically, that uh basically lines all the way back to the founding 9 individuals. I think it was 9, that were like these Cathar Albigensians, that called themselves the Perfecti, and they were initiated by, I think it was like Theocles and another name, which were, they were initiating and they helped form this group, but they were like in some other, maybe it was the Temple of Secret Initiates or something along those lines. But anyway, it's hard for me to try to explain all this history because I'm not as well versed, but from what's been conveyed to me, it seems fairly compelling that the roots of Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, a lot of the orders and societies that we know stem from and originate out of early Templar orders or initiates that had formed other orders. And like I said, it's a little bit difficult for me to recall the information and give it to you in a really concise format, but it seems like I feel comfortable saying that that's definitely a plausibility. I'm not saying that's a certainty, and I don't know that, but there's enough evidence or whatnot for me to feel at least a little bit comfortable and compelled by it, I would say.
Yeah. From what I've heard, and you might have been referring to Dr. Joseph Farrell, I believe we spent a good deal of time talking about the Templars, but I have talked about it with other people. And this idea that we're building the temple, right? We kind of opened with that idea, one of many. And when I hear that name Templar, it definitely brings to mind the word temple, but it also brings to mind the word template. And I've thought about this because there's this sort of notion that, the Templars were part of founding what we think of as the New World, right? Or maybe they were here prior and helped send some information back to the quote unquote old world about the quote unquote new world, right? And that's sort of what the whole Oak Island situation is predicated on, as well as the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, which isn't too far from where I'm sitting right now. But I definitely think there's no better candidate for a template built than Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm not sure if you're near Phoenix. I know you're in Arizona, but I've had a guy on the show named Corey Daniels who basically describes how Phoenix, he's got a website called the Phoenix Enigma, and a podcast too. He describes how Phoenix was sort of built as a Freemasonic ritual. And, not necessarily Templars, but still along those same lines of recreating, a great civilization from the ashes of an old one, right? That was a kind of a thought with Phoenix, is that a very ancient group of people once lived there. They even claim that there are canals that were, sort of filled in or repurposed. And it definitely seems like Arizona could be one of these special places that the Freemasons saw and were like, okay, we got to build here. As someone who's currently in Arizona, I'm guessing, what are your thoughts on that? I don't know, maybe you're from a different state because you did say before that you're only, staying at a relative's house, but yeah, are you in Arizona? Is that where you're from?
Yep. Yes, born and raised. And yeah, I am still currently in Arizona. Pretty close to Phoenix. I think I'd be considered Phoenix. But yeah, that's really interesting. And I think I have listened to a few different recordings with Corey Daniels. I actually think I reached out to him one time, but didn't hear back from him. But he does have some fascinating stuff that he goes into. And yeah, it's interesting. Like when you talk about like a template, a Freemasonic template, because when I look at Phoenix, I mean, honestly, to me, when I look at the layout, it's kind of boring compared to like a lot of the other cool spots out there. I mean, you look at something like Washington D.C. and like all the geometry with that, it's so much more to it. So I think like to me, it seems like there's a lot more thought put into it, but maybe, this isn't something I'm super researched in anyway, which I should be because I live here. But I would like to investigate and learn more about that because I think that is fascinating and interesting. And, just the name in general, Phoenix, rising from the ashes and all that. I think that's really cool. So maybe potentially that'll evolve into something, but it's not something I'm super like well versed or aware of at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah, no worries. I thought I'd bring that up. I do bring it up quite often, especially since Tara and I started this show, Esoteric America, which, if you do end up doing that work investigating, we'd love to have you on to talk about Arizona, Phoenix in particular, or wherever you are. I mean, Arizona's a big place. You might
I
not
have
be
to
that
gather some
close.
more intel.
Yeah. Yeah, please do, man. I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of all this is where you see the stuff that we're talking about now, like alchemy sort of encoded into buildings and cityscapes. And who knows, maybe there's like a symbolic or maybe subtle purpose to these grids, because I haven't been to Arizona, but I have been out west, and like for example, Indianapolis is kind of grid like.
Yeah.
Denver's kind of grid like. So I've been in cities like that. And compared to New England, which was built for like footpaths and wagon trails, like, it's definitely a lot more interesting out here if you want to drive
Yeah.
on, wild roads.
Well, when you talk about like the purpose of grids and stuff like that, what comes to mind for me is like ley lines and
Mm.
all that stuff. And that, I don't know what it is. It just gets me excited. And I love learning or trying to acquire any information about that. And I think that you've had a couple of really cool guests on about that stuff. And I've had a couple as well, but they're more actually the guy I had mentioned before, Roger Lambert. He's an alchemist, but he's also a geobiologist. But he's primarily focused on. He's in. I think he's in Italy or France actually. So not necessarily too much in the Americas or anything, but I mean, he's just blew my mind about the things that he's talked to me about with in terms of like a lot of the ancient cathedrals and a lot of the ancient churches and their choice of placement and where they chose to build particular structures, particular sacred structures on particular quote unquote ley line crossing points. Um, and there's a lot to it. Like he would talk about different grids that were all like there was like 4 different grids that he was talking to me about that are related to different ore. Like there's like a grid, like an ore of gold grid that's related to a particular doctor, and a lot of them are the names of doctor. There's like the Hartman grid and the something grid, like whatever. And so there's these grids of like ore or whatever, and then beyond that there's underground rivers and the crop and there's a particular something with um geobiological locations and underground rivers, and like in terms of where you sleep at night, you don't want to be sleeping on a above a underground creek or something like that.
Right.
It could be detrimental. There could be a potentially like spiritual entities or things arising, things like that.
Huh.
But I think what he was saying was that there's a way to transmute that, and that some of these churches would build particular structures that would transmute that energy, and then they would build maybe it was called the nave of the church of the cathedral on top of that, and then the spot of the altar. It would facilitate a particular energy and he was going into things like there's a lot of different cathedrals. Some of them would be like St. Peter's or whatever, but a bunch of them would be named that throughout the the land or whatever the areas, and those would all have some kind of significant connection. And all the St. Peter's, they would have like some kind of energetic grid line uh, connection or correspondence, and then maybe there was like a different saint that would be allocated towards different churches, and maybe those would have like a different kind of communication or connection of some kind in old times. And then I talked to this former Jesuit dude named Douglas Gabriel. He's super fascinating. He's somebody that goes deep into the ethers. He goes pretty much answer any question you have in some way, shape, or form about anything. And he was telling me that the crowns, because we were talking about crystals and crystal science and crystal energies and all of that. And he was telling me that the crowns that the priests or the royals had, they would have the particular, maybe it was gold or copper or whatever the material was, and then the arrangement of crystals around the crown would facilitate a particular energy that would put your brain waves into a, did you say theta or gamma, a particular state that would facilitate like a hyper learning state or something along those lines. And I don't know if this was connected or if I drew this connection, but I somehow got the impression that these different priests were communicating sort of psychically, if you would, maybe not, because maybe it's a form of technology with these crowns that they had, from point to point, from energetic point to point within these churches or these cathedrals, due to their position and location and the crowns that they had that were helping facilitate their brains and their brainwave states of being able to be connected somehow. And I don't know if that's still a possibility or if it's not, due to different like frequencies now that are in our or that are about like with Wi-Fi or 5G or whatever. But something that's super fascinating and interesting to me. So I don't know, just kind of ranting at this point, but when you brought that up, it got me excited.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. And I kind of got lost in thought thinking about multiple things you said. And I wonder, when it comes to, you know, the position of these underground streams, if maybe springs in particular, like, for example, we just went to a local spring and got our water there. It was a great place, felt really awesome to find it, and be like, oh, great, we can get this really clean water. It's, free. Just come and fill up our jugs, But I wonder if there's a way to build something near that structure to purify that in some way, like,
Yeah.
I think I've had a couple of different people on the shows kind of talked about those subjects, but geez, you've mentioned so many amazing guests and fantastic people to look into. I mean, if I were listening to this show, I would go right over to Philosophical Minds. You could find it on any app that you listen to this podcast on, and check out some of the conversations you've had, because you're really only brushing the surface there. And I appreciate you taking us on this sort of venture here. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? I know it's getting kind of late. I might fall a little bit.
Asleep?
No, no, no. My contact lens is like falling
Yeah.
out. It's like gonna fall out of my eye. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've had it on all day. But Sky, this has been really awesome, man. I want to invite you back on the show soon and continue this conversation. But yeah, but until next time, tell the folks, where they can find you. Of course, Philosophical Minds. You have a Patreon where they can support you. And any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to say again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on. Yep, the Patreon at Philosophical Minds Podcast. Check me out on Instagram, YouTube, whatever, and appreciate anything and everyone, whether it's a review, maybe it's a nice comment on maybe an episode, or nothing at all, just listening. It's always appreciated. And I guess last thoughts, maybe just be nice. Try to be nice to each other. Be compassionate. Try to do what you can when you can, and especially during these times right now, we should all kind of do a little bit more and be there for each other, not promote the divisive narratives that are being kind of pushed and perpetuated upon us. I think that's part of the solution to the problem. So, love you all who are listening and appreciate it, and love your podcast, Mark, and everything that you're doing. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Likewise. And everybody tuning in, please go over to the Philosophical Minds podcast, subscribe, and immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.